Have you ever been humiliated so deeply that the world seemed to stop breathing? Imagine paying for your seat in first class only to be told, in front of strangers, that you don't belong there, not because of what you did, but because of who you are. What would you do in that moment? Argue walk away, or hold that pain so quietly that it transforms into something powerful? This is the story of a man who did not shout, did not fight back, not with anger, but with vision. Elijah Carter, a black CEO, denied his dignity 30,000 feet above the ground, would soon make the entire airline industry face the storm of its own prejudice. But as he stood at that gate, heart pounding, he faced the same question. Every one of us must one day confront when injustice stares you down. Do you burn the system or rebuild it from within if you were him? What would you choose? Stay with us. This isn't just a story about power. It's about grace, courage, and the price of doing what's right. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the journey ahead. Seattle was wrapped in its usual morning silence. A thin veil of mist drifted across the tarmac, softening the edges of the world's silver light over gray metal. A hum of distant turbines awakening. Inside Terminal C, the hum of conversation mixed with the hiss of espresso machines and the hollow roll of carry-ons over polished tiles. At Gate B12, a man stood quietly near the window. Elijah Carter, 46 years old, CEO of Neural Bridge Systems, one of the nation's most respected artificial intelligence companies. A man who built his fortune on logic, data, and calm precision. But right now, he wasn't a CEO. He was just another traveler, holding a ticket, clutching a coffee, waiting for a flight. He wore a navy suit, the kind tailored not to impress but to fit quietly, like someone used to being both seen and ignored. His movements were deliberate, never hurried. He had learned, long ago, that patience was a form of armor. The announcement echoed North Star Airways Flight 271 to New York, boarding first-class passengers now. Elijah glanced at his boarding pass, Seat 2A, first class. He smiled faintly, remembering how his father used to whisper before every flight, "Son, the sky is the same for everyone. It's just the seats that make us forget." He picked up his briefcase and walked forward. The woman at the counter, her name tag read Rebecca Miles, smiled politely when she first looked up. Then something flickered in her eyes. A hesitation. That subtle, half-second pause Elijah knew far too well. "Good morning," he said. Voice warm, steady. "Boarding pass, please," she replied. Her tone clipped. He handed it over. She scanned the barcode. A small beep. Then her eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry, sir. Are you sure this is the right ticket?" Elijah blinked, surprised. "Yes, it was confirmed last night. Seat 2A. She checked again, pressing keys as if searching for a hidden error. Behind her, a line was forming. Someone sighed impatiently. Rebecca frowned. "I don't see your name on the active list for first class." Elijah leaned slightly forward, still calm. "I see. Could there be a system error?" She exhaled sharply through her nose, then called over a coworker. They whispered. The coworker shrugged. Finally, Rebecca turned back. "Sir, this happens sometimes with upgraded tickets." Her tone had changed softer, but patronizing. "I didn't get an upgrade," Elijah said quietly. "I paid for the ticket myself." Rebecca's eyes darted between the screen and his face. "Well, I'm afraid we'll have to move you to economy until this is resolved." A few passengers behind him murmured. One of them, a man in a gray blazer, chuckled, "Here we go again." The sound sliced through the air like a paper cut. Elijah's hand tightened around the handle of his briefcase. For a heartbeat, He wanted to say something sharp, something true, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded once, the kind of nod that carries decades of practiced restraint. "Of course," he said softly, "if that's what's needed." Rebecca printed a new boarding pass. "Seat 32C, she said. She didn't make eye contact when she handed it over. Elijah thanked her anyway. As he walked down the jet bridge, the warm air of the terminal turned to a metallic chill. He passed rows of passengers already settled into first class, reclining in wide leather seats, sipping orange juice, scrolling through their phones. Seat 2A was empty. He paused for just a second. The man in 2B, a white businessman, looked up, then gestured vaguely toward the flight attendant. "She'll take care of you," he said, assuming Elijah was lost. Elijah's lips parted slightly, then closed again. He nodded politely and kept walking. Back in row 32, the cabin smelled of coffee, plastic, and recycled air. He stowed his briefcase and sat down beside a sleeping teenager. The seat barely reclined. The noise of the engines vibrated through the floor. He stared ahead through the narrow aisle, past the curtain that separated him from the life he'd paid for, but wasn't allowed to access. And for a long moment, he felt the familiar ache, not of anger, but of recognition. It wasn't the first time, and deep down, he feared it wouldn't be the last. The plane lifted through the clouds. Rain streaked across the window like faint pencil marks on glass. Elijah opened his laptop. The glow reflected off his glasses, cold and steady. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. He opened a blank email, fingers hovering over the keyboard. To Board of Directors, Neural Bridge System Subject Sky Ethics, Preliminary Review. He stopped, staring at the blinking cursor. Something inside him shifted, not rage, but purpose. His father's voice echoed again. Years old, but crystal clear. "Don't fight with anger, son. Fight with your patience." He typed a new line. "Note: initiate background scan on North Star Airways leadership and safety filings. Possible compliance breach pattern. Confidential." He hit send. The teenager beside him stirred awake, glanced at Elijah's screen, then whispered, "Are you some kind of investigator?" Elijah smiled gently. "Not exactly," he said. "Just someone who believes in accountability." The flight continued quietly. The curtain ahead swayed slightly each time a flight attendant slipped through. He noticed how they smiled differently in the front wide, confident, and how those smiles vanished once they passed into economy. He didn't hate them. He pitied them, because they were part of something much bigger, a system so subtle it made good people do small, cruel things without even noticing. When the seatbelt sign lit up, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in New York shortly. Temperature outside is 71 degrees. Thank you for flying North Star Airways." Elijah closed his laptop. The teenager next to him looked nervous about landing. "First time flying?" Elijah asked. The boy nodded. Elijah smiled. "Don't worry. The sky doesn't judge anyone." The words surprised even him, soft, almost tender, but they lingered, true in a way that felt heavier than he expected. When the plane touched down, the applause from the front cabin rippled faintly to the back. People unbuckled, stood, stretched. The man in 2B walked past Elijah without a glance. Rebecca, the gate agent from Seattle, appeared near the door, greeting first-class passengers by name. No one looked toward row 32. Elijah waited until the aisle cleared. He reached for his briefcase, moved slowly down the jet bridge, and stepped into the terminal. At that exact moment, his phone buzzed. A notification. Video uploaded. Man denied first-class seat on North Star Airways. He tapped it. There he was on camera, calm but visibly humiliated. The caption read, "When money can't buy respect." It already had 40,000 views. Elijah exhaled not in surprise, but in quiet resignation. He put the phone away. Outside the terminal, the New York air was bright, sharp, and restless. He hailed a cab, opened his notebook, and wrote one simple line before closing it again. Sometimes, the storm begins with silence. He looked out the window as the city moved around him, the noise swelling like distant thunder. In his mind, he wasn't planning revenge. He was planning reform. By the time Elijah Carter landed back in Seattle, the video had already passed 2 million views. The hashtags were multiplying like sparks in dry grass. Pour Seat 2A. North Star bias. He didn't belong here. Every outlet wanted a statement. Every podcast wanted a soundbite. But Elijah said nothing. He had built NeuroBridge on silence, the kind that listens before it moves. He woke early the next morning, before dawn, standing by the kitchen window while the city lights blinked awake below. The rain tapped lightly on the glass, steady as a metronome. His reflection looked tired but unbroken. On the marble counter, his phone buzzed again. Messages from investors, journalists, friends, strangers. Some sent sympathy, others outrage. One, from a former college mentor, simply read, "Don't let this turn you into them." Elijah set the phone down. He didn't need sympathy. He needed truth. At NeuroBridge headquarters that afternoon, he walked through the glass doors as if it were any other Tuesday. His assistant, Dana Wells, followed with her tablet and an expression halfway between worry and admiration. "They're calling you the calmest man in America," she said. "You're trending higher than the airline." Elijah smiled faintly. "The storm isn't the noise," he said. "It's what happens after." Donna hesitated. "So, what are we doing about it?" Elijah stopped walking. The elevator doors opened, and for a moment they both stared at their reflections. The tall black man in the tailored suit, and the woman beside him who believed in him even when she didn't understand his patience. "Dana," he said softly, "pull every public record you can find on North Star Airways. Board structure, safety filings, vendor contracts. Start with the FAA portal." She blinked. "You think this is bigger than what happened at the gate, I think," Elijah said, stepping into the elevator. "When a system shows you its cracks, you don't patch them. You trace them to the foundation." By midnight, the NeuroBridge compliance team had built a private database. The airline's public filings looked clean on the surface, but there were inconsistencies. Missing maintenance logs, duplicate entries for aircraft repairs, the kind of mistakes no corporation that size should make unless someone wanted them hidden. Elijah scrolled through the files, the blue light from his screen cutting across the dark of his study. He sipped cold coffee, scanning each line. Something in the data pulsed wrong, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. A pattern. 17 planes, all maintained by the same subcontractor, the same supervisor signing each report. And every one of those aircraft had logged minor anomalies during the last quarter, anomalies that should have grounded them. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "They were cutting corners," he murmured. "Safety for schedule." His father's voice seemed to echo from memory. "Integrity doesn't announce itself. Son, it's what you do when no one's watching." He opened a secure line to Dana. "Wake up the audit team. I want confirmation on those serial numbers before sunrise." There was a pause. Then Dana's sleepy voice. "You're still working on this?" "Yes. Why, Elijah? You could call your lawyers, sue them, get a public apology, maybe a board seat. He interrupted gently. An apology fixes a moment, but this feels like something that breaks generations. Dana was quiet. Then she said, I'll get the team. By morning. Neural Bridge's analytics confirmed it. Northstar Airways had submitted falsified maintenance reports on multiple aircraft, including one that had suffered a near-engine failure over Denver the month before. The cover-up wasn't an error. It was policy. Elias stared at the data until the numbers blurred. Then he stood, walked to the window, and whispered to no one in particular. This isn't just about a seat anymore. That afternoon, he called an old acquaintance from Washington, someone at the Department of Transportation. They spoke briefly, in cautious tones. When the call ended, Elijah closed his notebook and looked at the photo of his late father on the shelf. I'll do it your way, Dad, he said softly. Not with anger, with precision. 2 weeks passed. The noise online began to fade, replaced by new scandals, new distractions. But behind the curtain, Neural Bridge's investment division had quietly purchased 8% of Northstar's public stock through secondary markets. No one noticed. Elijah moved slowly, methodically, like a man setting pieces on a chessboard no one else realized they were playing. At night, he walked alone through the city. Seattle's skyline shimmered across the water. Every reflection doubled one above, one below. He often thought of the contrast, the polished glass towers versus the quiet depths beneath them. Dana once asked if he ever got tired of fighting battles no one saw. He had smiled. The visible ones are easy, he said. It's the invisible ones that test who we really are. A week later, the board of Northstar Airways convened in their downtown headquarters to discuss the PR situation. Internal emails leaked to the press showed senior executives debating whether to issue an apology or wait for the noise to die down. Elijah read every word of those emails, forwarded anonymously by a Northstar employee who wrote in the subject line, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." He didn't know the sender's name, but he remembered it later. That evening, he met Dana at a quiet diner on the waterfront. The place smelled of coffee and salt. Rain tapped the windows again, softer this time. Dana slid a tablet across the table. "You now own 14%. The market hasn't caught on yet." Elijah looked at the number, unimpressed. "Keep it discreet. Use separate trusts. If anyone asks, it's diversification." "You're really doing this," she said. He nodded. "I'm not buying an airline. Dana, I'm buying accountability." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The clatter of dishes filled the silence. Then Dana said, "Do you think they'll ever understand why Elijah looked out the window at the gray water? Maybe not. But someday, someone else sitting in row 32 will get to stay where they belong. And they'll never know why it feels easier. That's enough." When he left the diner, the rain had stopped. The street smelled clean, almost new. A street light flickered as he passed beneath it, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a strange calm settle inside him. He wasn't chasing revenge. He was building something. A reckoning, perhaps, but one rooted in justice, not rage. As he walked toward his car, a notification blinked on his phone. A breaking news alert: Northstar Airways denies allegations of falsified safety data. He smiled. They were already afraid, driving home through the mist. He spoke softly to himself when fear starts to whisper. Truth is already knocking. The following morning, the market opened to quiet movement. Neural Bridge's acquisitions had gone unnoticed. Elijah reviewed the final purchase orders. His team had mapped a timeline in 3 weeks. Through layered trusts and shell holdings, they could reach a controlling interest 51%. Dana stepped into his office as he signed the authorization. "This feels dangerous," she said. "They'll come after you." He looked up at her, eyes calm, almost kind. They already did, at Gate B12. And for the first time, Dana didn't reply. She simply nodded. Elijah turned back to the window. Outside, a plane rose into the gray sky, small and silent. He wondered if it was one of theirs, one of the 17 with forged records. He hoped not. As the engines of the distant aircraft disappeared into cloud, Elijah whispered a line he hadn't said in years. Justice isn't loud. It's patient. Somewhere deep in his chest, something shifted again, that quiet transformation from wound to weapon, from humiliation to purpose. In the stillness of that office, the storm finally began to take shape. He wasn't angry anymore. He was ready. The morning sun spilled through the skyscrapers of downtown Seattle, slicing gold across the mirrored facade of the North Star Airways headquarters. To the public, it was just another Tuesday. Executives in press suits walking briskly through the marble lobby, assistants carrying tablets and coffee. But behind the glass walls of the top floor, a quiet tension pulsed beneath the hum of the air conditioning. Elijah Carter stood at the edge of the conference room, hands folded loosely in front of him. His reflection hovered in the polished table, calm but unreadable. He had arrived 10 minutes early. He always did. Punctuality was his language of control. Across the room, a man in a tailored gray suit, Alan Brooks. North Star's CEO scrolled through his phone with the impatience of someone used to owning the air around him. He was in his 50s, tanned from golf trips and smug from decades of privilege. When he finally looked up, his smile was all teeth. "Mr. Carter," he said, stepping forward with forced warmth. "Quite an honor. I wasn't expecting the great Neural Bridge CEO to take such an interest in aviation." Elijah returned the handshake, firm but not confrontational. "I like to understand where my investments fly," he said quietly. Alan's smile flickered for a second. "Of course. Well, we're thrilled to have you on board. North Star is a strong company. A little turbulence recently, but nothing we can't smooth out." "Turbulence," Elijah repeated, letting the word rest in the air like a test. Alan chuckled. "You know how the media is. One video, a few angry tweets, and suddenly we're the villains of the internet. But people forget fast. They always do." Elijah's gaze stayed steady. "I don't." For a moment, the room went still. Alan shifted his stance, suddenly uncertain. Then he gestured toward the screen at the end of the room. "Let's get started." The presentation began graphs, revenue charts, market share, brand trust, corporate theater. Elijah listened, eyes quiet but alert. He noticed the phrasing adjusted performance metrics, compliance realignment, words that smelled like evasion. After 20 minutes, Alan turned to him. "So, Mr. Carter, I understand you've recently acquired, 10% of our shares. Quite an investment." Elijah nodded. "A bit more than that now. 13 and climbing." "Impressive," Alan said, though his eyes hardened. "You'll find this industry isn't as easy as software." "Perhaps not," Elijah said. "But both depend on trust. And when trust crashes, no system survives." Dana Wells sat quietly beside Elijah, taking notes. Her expression was composed, but her pulse raced. She could feel the temperature drop in the room, the subtle dance of power beginning. Alan shifted topics, moving to diversity numbers, employee retention, customer satisfaction. Slides filled the screen with smiling faces models, not staff. Elijah let him talk. The words flowed like polished glass, smooth, transparent, and empty. Then, mid-sentence, Elijah spoke. "Play the video," he said. Alan blinked. "I'm sorry," Elijah's voice remained even. "The one from gate B12. "You've seen it." "Of course." Alan hesitated. "Mr. Carter, I don't think that's appropriate." "It's relevant," Elijah said, "because you mentioned brand trust. Let's see what the world sees." Dana tapped the tablet. The screen filled with the familiar footage, Elijah at the counter. The quiet humiliation. The murmur of bystanders. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the projector. When it ended, Elijah turned back to Alan. "That's your turbulence," he said softly. "And it's not a glitch. It's culture." Alan's jaw tightened. "This incident doesn't represent our company." "It was one employee's mistake." "One employee," Elia repeated. "Then why did the system erase my seat from the manifest before boarding? Why were my credentials flagged as fraudulent?" After payment cleared, Alan opened his mouth, closed it again. His assistant whispered something. Elijah continued, "Because bias isn't one person." He said, "It's a policy no one questions." The words landed like a slow detonation. Dana watched Alan's face, pride crumbling into something smaller, meaner. Elijah leaned forward slightly. "I didn't come here to embarrass you. I came because the truth is worse than you think. Your company isn't just prejudiced, it's unsafe." Alan laughed, sharp and nervous. "Unsafe? That's absurd." Elijah nodded toward Dana, who pulled up a second file. A spreadsheet appeared, dense with data, serial numbers, maintenance reports, red-marked anomalies. "These are your aircraft maintenance logs," Elijah said. "At least, the ones your contractors filed. 17 planes with falsified safety records, cross-referenced with FAA submissions. 2 near-fatal engine failures this quarter alone." Alan's color drained. "How did you made them public?" Elijah interrupted gently. "You just assumed no one would read them." For a moment, no one moved. The hum of the air vent sounded like thunder. Then Alan forced a laugh. "You're bluffing." Elijah didn't smile. "Am I?" He turned to Dana. "Show him the purchase agreements." On screen, a series of documents appeared signed, dated, stamped, one after another. The corporate shells that Neuralbridge had used to buy stock. The final line read combined holdings deemed 51.3%. Alan's hand froze midair. Elijah met his eyes. "As of this morning," he said, voice steady as a verdict, "I own your airline." The silence that followed was electric. Dana's fingers trembled slightly as she turned off the display. Alan looked like he'd been struck, his mouth working for words that wouldn't come. Finally, he managed, You planned this." Elijah exhaled slowly. "No, you did. You built a system so proud of its altitude it forgot to check its compass." Alan slammed his palm on the table. "You can't just walk in here and take over." Elijah stood. "I didn't walk in. You opened the door when you let injustice fly first class and truth sit in the back." He turned to Dana. "Notify the legal team. Begin the transition process. Effective immediately." Dana nodded, her face composed, but her eyes wide with awe. As Elijah walked toward the elevator, the board members whispered among themselves, confusion spreading like static. Alan shouted something after him, but the words blurred against the hum of the air vents. Outside the glass tower, the sky had begun to darken. Clouds rolled over the bay, heavy and gray. Seattle's weather always seemed to mirror his thoughts calm above, storms forming underneath. He paused at the entrance, looking up at the towering logo of North Star Airways. The silver wings gleamed under the fading light, proud and hollow. A thought crossed his mind, quiet and firm. Sometimes, to rebuild something worthy of flight, you have to ground what's broken first. When Dana caught up to him outside, she whispered, "You really did it?" Elijah looked at her, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. "Now we start." That night, in his office overlooking the harbor, he sat in silence for a long time. The city lights shimmered across the water, each reflection trembling slightly with the wind. He thought about his father, about patience, about the long road from Detroit to this glass fortress. He poured himself a cup of tea, watching the steam curl into the dim air. Every decision came with weight. Every choice left a trace. He wondered how many people would call him a hero tomorrow and how many would call him something else. But deep down, he didn't care. Heroes seek applause. He sought correction. On his desk, a single document waited: dry ground safety audit emergency protocol authorization. He didn't sign it yet. That would come later. For now, he needed stillness. He looked out at the sleeping city and whispered, "One step at a time." The lights of North Star's planes blinked faintly across the distant runway, tiny red dots vanishing into the night. For the first time, he wondered how many of those engines had truly been safe. And the thought anchored him to what he knew must come next. Change, not revenge, not anger, just change. Wide as the horizon and impossible to stop. The next morning, the city buzzed with rumors. The financial channels ran split-screen footage on one side, the calm face of Elijah Carter entering the North Star Tower. On the other, stock tickers trembling red. Tech CEO takes over Airline in secret buyout. The captions read. Reporters shouted questions across marble lobbies. But Elijah didn't answer any of them. He moved through the noise like someone who had already calculated every echo. In the new executive suite, the air smelled of polished wood and tension. Alan Brooks had been forced to hand over his access codes, but he hadn't left quietly. He sat in a corner chair, sleeves rolled up, the defiance in his posture sharp as glass. "You think this makes you a savior?" Alan said when Elijah entered. "You don't understand this business. You'll ground yourself before you fix anything." Elijah didn't look up from the documents in his hands. "I don't intend to save a business," he said. "I intend to rebuild a conscience." Alan scoffed. "Spare me the sermon. This is about revenge, not reform." Elijah raised his gaze, steady and unreadable. "If I wanted revenge," he said quietly, "you'd already be gone." The silence that followed was dense, like pressure before a storm. Dana Wells entered, placing a file on Elijah's desk. Her tone was brisk, professional, but her eyes betrayed the weight of what she carried. "Sir, we have confirmation. 3 more maintenance records were falsified. The FAA investigators want a meeting within 48 hours. Elijah nodded. "Arrange it? I want full cooperation." Alan laughed bitterly. "Full cooperation. You'll drown this company in red tape. You're going to ground planes, delay schedules, scare investors. Maybe," Elijah interrupted, "but I'd rather ground a fleet than bury passengers." Dana glanced between the two men, feeling the air grow tighter. The exchange wasn't loud, but every word felt like it carved something deeper into the foundation of the company. After Alan left, slamming the glass door behind him, Elijah turned to the window. Outside, clouds hung low over the bay, heavy and slow-moving. He could see the reflection of his own face faintly mirrored in the glass calm, but weary. Dana hesitated. Do you trust the FAA to act fairly? Elijah's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Fairly, no. But facts don't care about fairness. They care about proof. He spent the rest of the day reviewing reports, engine inspections, safety drills, employee complaints. The patterns were there, the same kind of negligence disguised by language and numbers. The deeper he read, the more the story began to change shape. It wasn't only bias or pride anymore. It was greed pure, practiced, institutional. Late in the evening, when the office emptied and the city lights shimmered across the harbor, Dana came in carrying 2 cups of tea. She set one beside him. You haven't eaten all day, she said softly. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Do you ever feel like the higher you climb, the less you see? She frowned. What do you mean? Up here, Elijah said, gesturing toward the skyline. Everything looks small. The people, the streets, even the mistakes. Maybe that's why men like Alan stop seeing consequences. The altitude blinds them. Dana sat across from him. And I remember the ground, he said. I grew up on it. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the sound. Elijah looked up, almost grateful for the soundstorms were honest. That night, he couldn't sleep. The city outside his penthouse was a mosaic of motion ferries cutting across dark water, headlights threading through rain. He sat by the window, sipping cold tea, thinking about his father again. The old man's voice returned, that deep, even tone shaped by factory noise and Sunday choirs. Integrity isn't loud. Son, it doesn't need to be. At dawn. Elijah returned to headquarters. The hallways were still, almost sacred. He walked past the portraits of past CEOs, a line of white faces in dark suits. He stopped at the end of the corridor and looked up at the empty space reserved for the next one. It would be his soon, though he doubted he'd hang his own picture. Dana met him at the elevator. The FAA team is here, she said. In the boardroom, 2 investigators waited, their expressions polite but skeptical. Elijah greeted them with the ease of a man who didn't need to impress. The lead investigator, a woman named Margaret Hayes, flipped through a thick folder. Mr. Carter, she said, we've reviewed your claims. These are serious accusations. If they're false, you could be facing defamation suits from your own company. Elijah met her eyes without flinching. If they're true, you'll be facing funerals. The room went silent. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll start inspections immediately. When they left, Dana let out a long breath. You really meant to go this far? There's no halfway, Elijah said. Not when lives are at stake. That evening, news outlets caught wind of the internal audit. The headlines turned from curiosity to panic. North Star shares plummet as new CEO orders full review. Commentators debated whether Elijah's actions were brilliance or madness. Investors called for reassurance, unions for protection. Alan Brooks appeared on a late-night talk show, his voice dripping with practiced outrage. This man is destroying a legacy. He said, he's weaponizing morality to justify control. Elijah watched the interview in silence. Then he turned off the television. Control isn't the point, he murmured. Conscience is. By the end of the week, the FAA released its preliminary findings. 27 aircraft were grounded pending further inspection. The report confirmed falsified maintenance logs, the same pattern Neural Bridge's team had uncovered. When Dana handed him the report, she said quietly, You were right. Elijah nodded, but his eyes were distant. Being right doesn't feel like winning. He looked out over the runways from his office window. Rows of planes sat motionless under the gray sky, wings gleaming wet with rain. They looked peaceful, but the stillness carried weight, a reminder of how easily motion can hide decay. Down on the tarmac, mechanics worked in yellow raincoats, inspecting engines under spotlights. Elijah watched them for a long time, his hand pressed against the cold glass. He thought of the passengers who would be delayed, the employees who would lose hours, the headlines that would twist his motives. He whispered, almost to himself, better a pause than a tragedy. That night, as the storm outside thickened, Dana found him still in the office. "You should rest," she said. He shook his head. "Not yet. There's one more thing I need to see." She followed his gaze to the security monitors. The feed showed the grounded planes lined up like silent witnesses. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He answered without turning, that every lie has a runway, and this is where theirs ends. For the first time, she didn't argue. She understood. When he finally left, the city was drenched in thunder and reflection. The rain washed everything: streets, glass, even memory. He walked slowly toward his car, coat collar turned up, feeling the storm break against his shoulders. In the distance, lightning split the sky. He paused, watching it illuminate the outline of an airplane suspended in the dark, motionless but alive. In that brief flash of light, Elijah saw something almost sacred, the fragile balance between flight and fall, between justice and destruction. He whispered under his breath, "Tomorrow, we begin grounding them all." And when he drove away, the rain swallowed the sound of his tires, leaving only the soft echo of resolve behind. Morning came heavy with the weight of consequence. The skyline of Seattle shimmered beneath low clouds, and the city carried the restless hum of gossip. Every headline shouted Elijah Carter's name. Black Tech CEO grounds planes, markets panic, hero or tyrant. The talk shows dissected him, panel by panel, each commentator pretending to understand his motives. Yet behind the noise, in the quiet of North Star's headquarters, Elijah sat alone at his desk, watching rain streak down the window like veins on glass. Dana Wells entered with her usual calm, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "The FAA's full audit begins tomorrow," she said, setting a tablet before him. "But there's something else. Alan Brooks has been meeting with board members privately. We think he's trying to rally them against you." Elijah didn't look up. "Let him," he said. "Some men need to feel powerful one last time before they realize what power truly costs." Dana hesitated. "You're making enemies, Elijah, real ones." He closed the file and leaned back, his voice quiet but sharp. "I didn't inherit enemies, I exposed them." Outside, a distant rumble echoed across the sound thunder or aircraft. It was hard to tell. He stood and walked to the window. Below, the runways were lined with motionless planes, their wings gleaming like sleeping giants. To the untrained eye, it looked like defeat, but Elijah saw something else, the stillness before correction. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret Hayes, the FAA investigator, stepped in, holding a slim folder. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone formal, "I thought you'd want to see this personally." He gestured for her to sit. She opened the file. "Our engineers confirmed 2 major violations. Maintenance logs were intentionally altered. A whistleblower came forward anonymously. For now, but their testimony is credible." Dana leaned closer. "Do we know who?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. They're scared. They said they tried to report issues before, but were ignored." Elijah tapped a finger against the table thoughtfully. "Ignored," he repeated. That's how rot spreads, not by malice, but by silence. Margaret studied him. I'll admit, when I first met you, I thought this was a vanity crusade. But you're serious about this. He met her gaze. If I weren't, those planes would still be flying. As she left, Dana whispered, "She's starting to believe you." Elijah smiled faintly. Truth doesn't need believers. It needs patience. That afternoon, Alan Brooks stormed into his office without knocking. His face was flushed with anger, his voice already loud. "You've turned this company into a circus. Do you know how many flights are canceled today? 12,000 passengers stranded. You've destroyed our credibility." Elijah didn't rise from his chair. "No," he said evenly, "I exposed it." Alan slammed his fist on the desk. "You think people care about your moral crusade? They care about getting where they're going. You're not saving lives. You're ruining livelihoods." For a moment, Elijah said nothing. Then he leaned forward, voice low, almost intimate. "You ran this company like altitude excused arrogance. You taught people that schedules mattered more than safety, that passengers were data points, not lives. That ends today," Alan sneered. "You think you can replace me? You're a tourist in this business. Carter, a man who bought his way into an empire, he doesn't understand." Elijah stood, slow and deliberate. "You're right," he said softly. "I didn't grow up flying private. I grew up fixing engines that men like you ignored. My father used to say, 'Never trust a machine that hums too quietly. It's hiding something.'" He was talking about cars. Turns out, he was talking about people too. The silence after that was sharp. Alan turned away, muttering curses under his breath as he left. Dana waited until the door closed before speaking. "You didn't have to provoke him." "I didn't," Alicia said. "The truth did." As night fell, the rain intensified. The city lights blurred into amber reflections on the soaked pavement. Elijah sat in the dim glow of his office, reviewing the whistleblower's notes. One phrase stood out, scribbled in uneven handwriting. "They told us to sign off the reports or lose our jobs." He thought of the workers on the ground, engineers, technicians, cleaners, the people whose hands kept the sky safe. He'd been one of them once, long before the titles, before Neural Bridge. That memory kept him human. Even now, when the world wanted him to be a symbol. Dana entered quietly with a stack of emails. Public relations is begging for a statement. Investors are threatening to pull out. Elijah glanced up. "And what would they prefer, I say? That profits come before protection. The convenience outweighs conscience." "They want reassurance," she said gently. He smiled without warmth. "Then reassure them that I'll never apologize for doing what's right." Outside, the storm broke fully. Lightning split the sky, followed by a deep, rolling thunder that rattled the windows. For a moment, the sound filled the room, drowning out everything else. Elijah looked toward the horizon, the flashes illuminating his reflection. "Every storm reveals the cracks," he murmured. The next morning, headlines screamed again. "North Star crisis deepens." Alan Brooks appeared on camera, accusing Elijah of corporate sabotage. Commentators called it the boldest power struggle in aviation history. Some called Elijah a visionary. Others called him reckless. But amidst the noise, something unexpected happened. Messages began arriving from North Star employees, maintenance workers, flight attendants, ground crews. They wrote to thank him. One said, "We've been scared for years. You did what none of us could." Another simply wrote, Finally, someone grounded the truth. Dana read the messages aloud as Elijah listened in silence. His eyes softened. "They're the ones who matter," he said, "not the shareholders." That night, Margaret Hayes called again. Her tone was urgent. "Mr. Carter, the FAA board's requesting a full halt. All aircraft pending investigation. They want you to sign the grounding order officially." Elijah paused. He knew what it meant. The largest grounding since 9/11 chaos in every airport. Billions lost overnight. But he also knew what would happen if he didn't. "Send me the document," he said quietly. "I'll sign it after the call." He walked to the window once more. The rain had stopped. The night was still. Dana entered, holding the printed order. She hesitated. "Once you do this, there's no going back." He took the pen, turning it in his hand. There never was. He signed. The ink dried under the dim light of his desk lamp. Outside, a wind rose over the bay, rustling through the silence of the grounded planes. Somewhere across the city, alarms would soon begin to ring airports freezing operations. Flights canceled, passengers stranded, the media would explode. But for now, everything was calm. Elijah exhaled slowly, setting the pen down. "Ground them all," he whispered. Dana watched him, awe, fear, and respect mixing in her gaze. "You just stopped the sky," she said softly. "No," Elijah replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I just gave it a reason to rise again." At that moment, thunder rolled one last time across the darkened skyline. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered deep, steady, unstoppable. And beneath that echo, history quietly shifted course. Dawn crept across the horizon like a secret too heavy to keep. The rain had washed the city clean, but in the stillness that followed, the silence felt almost unnatural. Airports from Boston to Los Angeles stood frozen, runways glimmering under blinking caution lights. Planes sat in perfect rows, wings stretched wide but motionless, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to breathe. Inside North Star's headquarters, the world was chaos. Phones rang without pause. Journalists camped outside the lobby, and board members paced in agitation. Yet at the center of it all, Elijah Carter moved like a man, underwater slow, deliberate, unshaken. His signature on the grounding order had already rippled through every level of the industry. He had stopped more than a fleet. He had stopped time. Dana Wells entered his office, her face pale from lack of sleep. "The networks are calling it the Carter shutdown," she said. "Airlines are panicking. Congress is demanding answers. People are stranded everywhere." Elijah looked up from the report in front of him. "Are they safe?" he asked. She blinked. "Who?" "The passengers," he said. "Are they safe?" Dana hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. No accidents. No incidents since the order." "Then the noise is worth it," Elijah said quietly. He stood and walked toward the glass window overlooking the tarmac. From this height, the planes looked like grounded birds, resting after years of relentless flight. He wondered how many times these machines had defied gravity carrying lives inside them. Behind him, the door burst open. Alan Brooks stormed in again, flanked by 2 board members. His tie was loosened, his voice already sharp. "You've lost your mind. Carter, do you have any idea what you've done? 48,000 employees are in limbo. The stock dropped 40% overnight. We're bleeding billions." Elijah didn't turn around. "Then perhaps the wound was already there," he said. "I only stopped the bleeding from spreading." Alan slammed a hand against the wall. "You're destroying this company." Elijah finally faced him. No, Alan, I'm saving it from the disease you called efficiency. The tension in the room was electric. The board members shifted uncomfortably, torn between fear and disbelief. Alan pointed at Elijah, voice cracking. You're finished here. The board will vote you out by the end of the day. Elijah's calmness was unsettling. You'll need 51% for that vote, he said, and I already counted them. Alan froze, realizing too late what that meant. One of the board members spoke quietly. He's right. Alan, the shareholders back him now. The FAA audit changed everything. Alan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from his face. For the first time, he looked small. You think history will forgive you for this, he muttered. Elijah's voice softened. I don't need forgiveness. I need accountability. Alan left without another word. The sound of the door closing echoed like an ending long overdue. For a while, the office remained silent except for the faint hum of the city below. Dana broke the quiet first. They'll come for you. Elijah. Politicians, investors. The union someone's going to want to scalp. I'm not hiding, he said. If they want mine, they'll have to explain why. Later that afternoon, the FAA released an emergency statement confirming Elijah's findings. 27 aircraft had falsified inspection data. 2 were deemed unsafe for service. The public, initially furious about the cancellations, began to shift. News anchors replayed the footage from the viral video that had started it all, Elijah at Gate B-12, calm and dignified as his seat was taken away. The story transformed before the world's eyes from scandal to symbol. People began calling it the grounding of conscience. By evening, reporters flooded the streets outside North Star. Dana stepped into Elijah's office again, a mix of excitement and disbelief on her face. The polls are changing. Public opinion swinging your way. Even the White House is requesting a statement. Elijah smiled faintly. Interesting how truth travels slower than outrage, but lasts longer when it arrives. She leaned on the doorway. You could go on television, explain yourself. People want to hear from you. He shook his head. Not yet. The truth doesn't need a performance. When night fell, he left the office for the first time in days. The city felt different, quieter, cautious. Outside the terminal, hundreds of passengers gathered around news screens, watching coverage of the grounding. Some cursed his name, others whispered prayers of gratitude. A man in a mechanic's jacket approached him, not recognizing who he was. Crazy, huh? Whole airline's down. But you know what? Maybe it's about time. We've been fixing the same busted systems for years. Elijah nodded slowly. Sometimes you have to stop the machine before you can repair it, he said. The man laughed. I'm into that, and walked away. Driving home. Elijah felt the exhaustion settle into his bones. Yet beneath the fatigue was something steadier, a quiet certainty that what he'd done mattered, even if no one saw it clearly yet. When he arrived at his apartment, the city lights stretched out like a constellation of restless souls. He poured a glass of water and sat by the window, staring at the distant lights of the airport. For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of it, every canceled flight, every stranded traveler, every headline bearing his name. Then he whispered to himself, grounding isn't failure. It's how you teach a system to stand again. The next morning, Dana was already in his office when he arrived. Her voice trembled slightly. Elijah, the FAA wants a press conference. They want you to explain why you grounded the planes. He set his briefcase down, Then we'll tell them the truth. A few hours later, cameras filled the conference hall. Reporters shouted questions as Elijah stepped onto the podium, the air charged with anticipation. He stood behind the microphone, his expression calm but resolute. "Yesterday," he began, his voice carrying through the room, "North Star Airways halted all flights nationwide. Some call it chaos, some call it madness. I call it responsibility." The room quieted. He continued, his tone even but firm. "I've read your headlines. You say I stopped the world from moving. But tell me, what good is movement if it's heading toward disaster? What good is speed without safety, or profit without integrity?" He paused, letting the silence fill the room. "I didn't ground these planes because of anger. I did it because every log, every falsified report, every overlooked inspection is a gamble with human lives. And I refuse to let this company or any company bet on people's lives again." Dana watched from the side, her heart pounding. Every word landed like a steady drumbeat of truth. Elijah finished softly. "The sky belongs to everyone, but for it to remain free, it must also remain honest." When he stepped away, the room stayed silent for a full 3 seconds. A silence heavy with reflection, before applause erupted. Cameras flashed, voices rose, and the story shifted once again. Later that night, Elijah stood alone outside the building, feeling the wind brush against his face. The air was cool, the storm finally gone. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, letting the night air carry the weight of everything he had unleashed. He didn't know what would come next: lawsuits, hearings, investigations. But he knew the truth had already taken flight. And once truth takes off, it doesn't land quietly. Dana joined him at the curb, her voice gentle. "The world's watching you now." Elijah opened his eyes, a tired smile touching his face. "Then let them see what accountability looks like." As they walked toward the car, the city hummed faintly behind them, and above the skyline, the first plane in 2 days cut through the clouds, a single streak of silver returning to the open air. Elijah watched it ascend, and for the first time, the sky looked clean again. The morning after Elijah's speech, the world trembled between outrage and admiration. Major networks looped his words. The sky belongs to everyone. But for it to remain free, it must also remain honest. Like scripture for a new kind of revolution. Airports were still silent, but something else was moving now: understanding. Across social media, passengers who had once cursed him began to write messages of thanks. Families of flight attendants, engineers, and technicians spoke up, sharing stories of pressure, negligence, and cover-ups. What Elijah had grounded wasn't just a fleet. It was fear, but truth, once airborne, attracts storms of its own. By mid-morning, North Star's boardroom buzzed with reporters' questions and political backlash. Lawmakers demanded explanations for the economic fallout. News tickers flashed grim numbers. Estimated loss $4.2 billion. Investors threatened lawsuits. Meanwhile, Alan Brooks was nowhere to be found. Though his voice lingered through the chaos-leaked voicemails, anonymous tips, bitter interviews calling Elijah a self-righteous saboteur in a tailored suit. Inside his corner office, Elijah sat quietly with a cup of coffee untouched beside him. His tie was loosened, the exhaustion visible but not dominant. Dana Wells entered, clutching a stack of legal briefs. Her tone was cautious. "You need to see this. The Senate's Transportation Committee wants a hearing. They're calling it a national emergency." He looked up, his eyes steady. "Good," he said. "Let them ask. I have answers." She frowned. "Elijah, They don't want answers. They want control. He leaned back in his chair. Then they'll have to confront why they lost it. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was Margaret Hayes. Her voice was low, urgent. Mr. Carter, I thought you should know the whistleblower came forward. Her name's Clara Jennings, senior engineer at a North Star maintenance hub in Denver. She's agreed to testify publicly. Is she safe? Elijah asked immediately. For now, Margaret said. But there's pressure on her. Internal emails show she was warned to stay quiet weeks before the grounding. Elijah's tone hardened. No more warnings. Tell her we'll protect her. Neuralbridge will provide counsel and security. When the call ended, Dana exhaled. You're stepping into something enormous. The government. Corporate lobbies. They'll tear into you. He smiled faintly. Let them. Maybe the air finally needs turbulence. That afternoon, the press swarmed the headquarters again. Elijah didn't appear. Instead, he sat with Clara Jennings in a quiet conference room, away from cameras. She was in her late 30s, her hands trembling slightly as she held a worn folder. I tried to report it, she said, her voice breaking, but they buried every complaint. They said we'd lose funding, that the public didn't need to know. They made us sign off on repairs that were never finished. Alicia listened without interrupting, his gaze compassionate but focused. You did the hardest thing a person can do, he said gently. You told the truth when silence was safer. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Do you really think this will change anything? He nodded once. If the truth costs us everything, then it changes everything. When she left, Dana lingered by the door. She's brave, she said softly. She reminds me of my mother. Elia replied. She used to say, justice begins when someone finally decides to stop whispering. By evening, the news broke about Clara's testimony. Her name trended worldwide. For every critic who called her a liar, 10 others called her a hero. The tide was turning faster than anyone expected. But the next blow came quietly. Late that night, Dana burst into Elijah's apartment, phone in hand. They've leaked your financials, she said breathlessly. They're saying you profited from the grounding that Neuralbridge's AI contracts with federal safety boards were a setup. Elijah took the phone, reading the article silently. The claims were exaggerated, but not entirely false. Neuralbridge had indeed supplied predictive safety algorithms to the FAA contracts established years before any of this began. Yet the timing was enough to taint the narrative. They're trying to shift the story, he murmured. Dana paced, her voice rising. They're calling you corrupt. Elijah, the same people who ignored the cover-ups are now accusing you of orchestrating this for money. He remained still. They can smear my name. They can question my motives. But they can't erase the data. She stopped pacing, staring at him. Doesn't it bother you? They're dismantling everything you've built. He looked out the window, the city glowing beneath the night. What I've built doesn't live in headlines. It lives in what comes after. That night, he barely slept. Memories stirred his father's rough hands fixing engines, the hum of machines that never rested, the weight of being unseen and underestimated. He remembered the day his mother told him, when they refuse to see your worth, don't shout. Just keep doing what they can't ignore. The next morning, Margaret Hayes called again. Her tone carried urgency. The Senate hearing is tomorrow. They're framing it as a public reckoning. Alan Brooks is expected to testify, too. Elijah's voice didn't waver. Then I'll see him there. The hearing took place in Washington under glaring lights and restless cameras. Rows of officials filled the chamber. Alan sat at one end of the table, his jaw tight, his suit immaculate. Elijah entered from the opposite side, flanked by Dana and Margaret. The contrast was sharp, one man clinging to power, the other to purpose. Senator Graves, the committee chair, began the questioning. Mr. Carter, your grounding order has cost this country billions. Do you believe one executive should have that kind of authority? Elijah met her gaze. When the alternative is gambling with human lives? Yes, I do. The senator's eyes narrowed. And what about the accusation that your company benefited financially from these actions? I built Neural Bridge to make systems safer, Elijah replied. If safety profits, then maybe that's the first time greed did something right. A murmur rippled through the room. Alan Brooks leaned forward, his voice dripping with scorn. You're a manipulator, Carter. You used a personal incident to hijack an entire industry. You humiliated this company to feed your ego. Elijah turned his head slowly, meeting Alan's glare. You humiliated yourself when you taught your staff that some passengers don't belong where they paid to sit. I didn't create that culture. I ended it. For a moment, the room was still. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Then Senator Graves cleared her throat. Mr. Brooks, records show that during your tenure, safety violations were systematically ignored. Do you deny that Alan hesitated, his confidence faltering? I relied on reports from my team. Reports you ordered altered, Elijah interjected quietly. I have the emails. The chamber erupted in whispers. Margaret handed the printed evidence to the clerk. Alan's face drained of color. The committee chair struck the gavel sharply. Order. When the hearing adjourned hours later, the press swarmed the hallway. Elijah didn't stop to speak. He simply walked out into the gray afternoon, the air thick with drizzle and flashbulbs. Dana caught up to him, her voice trembling. You did it. You exposed him. He shook his head. I didn't expose him. He exposed himself. I just turned on the lights. That evening, alone in his hotel room. Elijah stood at the window watching airplanes glide through the mist. The skies had reopened earlier that day, cautiously but safely. For the first time in weeks, the hum of engines in the distance didn't sound like arrogance. It sounded like healing. He whispered to himself. Maybe grounding was never about stopping flight. Maybe it was about teaching it what it's for. He poured himself a glass of water, the reflections rippling gently as he raised it. To the ones who never stopped believing the sky could change, he said quietly, almost like a prayer. Outside, a plane rose slowly through the clouds, steady, deliberate, and honest. The day after the Senate hearing, Washington buzzed with quiet disbelief. The footage of Elijah Carter confronting Alan Brooks had flooded every news outlet in the country. Commentators dissected his calm composure, calling it a masterclass in restraint or the face of modern justice. For some, he was a hero. For others, a dangerous symbol, a man who had proven that power could be taken, not just given, in a downtown hotel suite. Elijah stood by the window, staring at the Capitol dome washed in pale morning light. He hadn't slept. The adrenaline from the hearing had faded, leaving behind a heavy quiet. Every decision, every word, had been deliberate. But now came the harder part, what to do when the truth has already detonated. Dana Wells entered with 2 coffees. You've been up all night, she said softly, setting one beside him. The FAA just released an interim report. They're recommending permanent reforms, independent safety oversight, whistleblower protections, mandatory audit transparency. Aaliyah turned, the faintest smile touching his lips. It's a start. Dana hesitated before adding, But Alan's lawyers are filing for defamation. He's blaming you personally for the company's losses. They want damages." He exhaled slowly, as if the air itself carried weight. "Of course they do. You could fight back publicly," she said. "Go on the air. People believe you now. Use it." Elijah shook his head. If truth needs to shout, it was never strong enough to stand. For a moment, Dana studied him. "Sometimes I wonder how you stay so calm," she said. He glanced toward the window. "Because anger burns fast, but change takes oxygen." Later that afternoon, Elijah met with Margaret Hayes at the FAA's headquarters. The walls of her office were lined with framed photos pilots, engineers, first responders' faces that reminded him why he'd started this fight. She motioned for him to sit. "You're not an easy man to define." "Mr. Carter," she said with a small smile. "Half the country calls you reckless. The other half wants to name an airport after you." He smiled faintly. "I'll settle for cleaner engines and honest records." Margaret nodded, then handed him a sealed folder. "This is the final audit. It's worse than we thought. 32 falsified safety logs across multiple regions. The negligence was systemic, not isolated. We're forwarding it to the Department of Justice." Elijah opened the folder and skimmed the lines in silence. The words blurred: altered data, unverified repairs, pilot complaints ignored. He closed it gently, his face unreadable. "They'll need to answer for this," he said. "They will," Margaret replied. "But you know they'll drag you down with them. Brooks's allies are framing this as a vendetta. You've embarrassed powerful people." Elijah looked up, calm as still water. Then they should have built something worth respecting. That evening, back in Seattle, the storm that had followed him for weeks seemed to soften. The skies were clear, the city's air traffic lights blinking steadily once again. Elijah returned to North Star's headquarters now under his leadership fully and walked through the empty corridors. It was strange how quiet power felt when stripped of ego. He paused outside the engineering wing. Inside, a few late-night technicians were working under soft fluorescent lights. He entered quietly. One of them, a middle-aged mechanic named Luis, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Carter," he stammered. "Didn't expect to see you here." Elijah smiled. "Couldn't sleep? Thought I'd see where the real work happens." Luis hesitated, then said, "We've been talking, sir. Some of us. We didn't think anyone up top cared what happens down here." "I do," Elijah said simply, "and I always will." Luis' eyes glistened. "You did something none of them ever would. You listened." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "Keep the planes honest," he said quietly. "That's all I ask." As he left the hangar, Dana was waiting by the car. "You look tired," she said. "Just human." He replied with a small smile. The next morning, headlines shifted again, this time in his favor. FIA confirms Carter's findings. North Star whistleblower. Vindicated. Public sentiment swelled like a tide finally turning toward justice. But beneath the praise, something unexpected happened. Elijah began receiving letters, thousands of them, from pilots, passengers, mothers, and students. Some thanked him for his courage. Others shared stories of their own moments when they'd been silenced, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. He read every one. One letter, written by a young black pilot trainee from Texas, struck him hardest. "They told me no one who looked like me ever made captain. But when I saw you stand there calm, unshaken, I realized I didn't need permission to belong." Elijah read it twice, then placed it on his desk. For the first time in days, his eyes closed, and he smiled. That's the real win, he murmured. But peace never lingers long where truth challenges profit. That night, Dana rushed into his office again, panic flashing in her voice. Elijah, there's been a breach. Someone hacked our internal server's investor files, personal communications, even your FAA correspondence. They're leaking everything. He stood slowly, the calm in his movements unnerving. Who were tracing it, she said, but it's organized. Looks like someone from Allen's network. Elijah walked to the window, the reflection of the city lights shimmering in the glass. Let them leak it, he said. Dana stared at him. You can't be serious. Transparency terrifies those who built power on secrecy, he said. If they want to show the world everything I've done, let them. There's nothing I've hidden. By midnight, the leaks flooded the internet. Private memos, board communications, even Elijah's internal notes. But instead of scandal, the reaction was awe. The documents revealed not corruption, but consistency, ethical reviews, anonymous donations to employee aid funds, plans for an independent oversight board. Every word reinforced what he had stood for. The next day, public support surged again. Reporters began calling him the CEO who refused to lie. In the boardroom, Dana looked at him in disbelief. You turned their attack into proof. Elijah smiled faintly. Truth has one advantage they'll never understand. It doesn't panic. Meanwhile, Alan Brooks' legal team unraveled under the weight of the DOJ investigation. Subpoenas went out, indictments loomed, and one by one, his allies vanished. The empire he had built on arrogance began to collapse. A week later, Clara Jennings' testimony became the headline story on every major network. She spoke with quiet dignity about what she had seen, the corruption she'd endured, and the fear she'd overcome. When asked why she came forward, she said, because someone showed me that silence isn't safety, it's surrender. Elijah watched the interview alone in his office. When it ended, he turned off the television and sat in the quiet. The city outside glowed against the night sky, serene and endless. Dana entered a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of tea. She set one beside him. You know, she said softly, you might have changed more than this company. Elijah looked out the window, the faint hum of aircraft engines returning to the air. Change doesn't start in companies, he said. It starts in conscience. For the first time in weeks, he felt the exhaustion lift, replaced by something gentler, a sense of purpose fulfilled, though not finished. As he looked at the distant horizon, where the lights of departing planes disappeared into the clouds, he whispered, Fly right this time. And outside, the night sky, vast and silent, seemed to listen. The days that followed felt unreal. For the first time in months, North Star's headquarters didn't vibrate with tension. The hallways that once echoed with urgent meetings and whispered fears now carried something different, the quiet rhythm of rebuilding. On every floor, teams worked late, not out of fear of reprimand, but pride. Engineers, flight attendants, and managers who had long stayed silent were speaking up. The company was breathing again. From the corner office, Elijah Carter watched it all unfold. The skyline glowed against the early morning fog, and the faint hum of aircraft filled the air once more. It wasn't the same sound as before. This one felt steadier, cleaner, as though the sky itself had forgiven them for the years of negligence. Dana Wells entered with a folder tucked under her arm. The new safety committee proposal is ready, she said, placing it on his desk. Independent oversight, quarterly public audits, direct employee reporting lines. It's everything you asked for. Elijah smiled, faint but genuine. Everything we promised," he corrected. Dana studied him for a moment. "You know, some people are saying you've done the impossible. You turned a scandal into a blueprint." He looked out the window. "There's no blueprint for doing what's right. You just start where it hurts the most and don't stop until it's clean." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else. The president's office reached out. They want you to join a national task force on corporate ethics in aviation. They're calling it the Carter Commission." He didn't turn around. "A task force won't fix conscience," he said quietly. "But maybe it can remind people what it looks like." Dana smiled softly. "You should accept it. Even symbols can build bridges." Elijah finally faced her. "I'll consider it." Later that morning, the elevator doors opened to reveal a crowd waiting and the lobby employees holding signs that read, "Thank you. Elijah and you grounded the lie. So we could fly again." They clapped as he passed, some with tears in their eyes. He wasn't used to applause. It made him uncomfortable, like light that was too bright to stand in for long. Outside, reporters still lingered near the gates. One shouted, "Mr. Carter, do you think you've redeemed North Star?" He paused, his voice calm but resonant. "Redemption isn't mine to give," he said. "It belongs to those who choose to change." The clip spread across the internet within hours. Commentators called it humility. Others called it brilliance. Elijah didn't read any of it. That evening, he went home to a quiet apartment filled only with the scent of brewed tea and rain-soaked city air. He sat by the window, remembering his father again, the smell of oil and steel, the lessons whispered over broken engines. "Son, fixing a machine isn't about replacing parts. It's about understanding where it lost its rhythm." North Star, he thought, had finally found its rhythm again, but he also knew how easily it could falter. The next morning, Margaret Hayes arrived at the headquarters. Her expression was firm but approving. "The Department of Justice has concluded its review," she said. "Brooks is facing criminal charges for falsification and obstruction. Several executives are cooperating. It's over. Elijah." He didn't smile. "It's never over." He said, "Accountability isn't an event. It's maintenance." Margaret studied him. "You're a rare one," she said. "Most people, after winning something like this, would be celebrating." Elijah looked down at the papers on his desk lists of safety audits, new employee programs, reform proposals. "This wasn't a victory," he said softly. "It was a correction." Margaret nodded slowly. Maybe that's why it worked. When she left, Dana entered again, holding her phone. "You should see this," she said, her tone almost light. "Claire Jennings just did another interview. She said the reforms gave her back her faith in leadership. She called you the man who proved ethics can fly." Elijah chuckled, the sound rare, but real. "Clara always had better words than I did." Dana sat across from him. "You realize you've become something more than a CEO. Right? People are looking to you now not for planes or profits, but for permission to believe in good leadership again." He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "That's dangerous," he said. "People should believe in principles, not in men." She smiled. "Sometimes they need to see both in the same place first." The following week, Elijah flew to Denver for the reopening of North Star's main maintenance hub, the same place where Clara had once risked her career to speak up. The hangar was filled with hundreds of workers, mechanics in oil-stained coveralls, engineers with clipboards, and young apprentices watching him with awe. When he stepped to the microphone, the room fell quiet. "I came here," he began, his voice even but warm. Not as your CEO, but as your student, because you taught me something that no system is broken beyond repair, as long as someone is willing to get their hands dirty to fix it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. He continued, "For too long, companies like this believed that silence was loyalty. But silence doesn't build trust, it buries it. From today forward, North Star belongs to the people who make it safe, not the ones who make it profitable." Applause thundered through the hangar. Clara stood near the front, tears glistening as she clapped. Elijah caught her eye and nodded, not in pride, but gratitude. Later that evening, as he walked along the tarmac with Dana, the sun dipped below the mountains, bathing everything in orange light. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the crisp air, strangely comforting. "Do you ever think about that day at the airport?" Dana asked quietly. "Every day," he said. "That moment was humiliation. But maybe it was also a kind of invitation to see how much higher we could rise, if we learned from what pulled us down." She smiled. "You always find poetry in pain." He glanced at her. "That's where truth hides best." They stood for a while in silence, watching a test plane ascend into the fading light. Its engines roared, powerful and free. For the first time, Elijah didn't flinch at the sound. It didn't remind him of arrogance anymore. It reminded him of possibility. The next morning, he received a letter from the president's office. The Carter Commission had been approved, and he was appointed chair. It would oversee ethics across all major transportation systems, not just airlines, but rail and freight as well. The scope was enormous, the responsibility heavier than ever. He folded the letter carefully and set it on his desk. "So it begins again," he murmured. Dana looked at him curiously. "Do you ever wish you'd just stayed at Neural Bridge? Life would have been simpler." Elijah smiled faintly. "Simple doesn't always mean meaningful." She laughed softly. "You really don't rest, do you?" He looked out the window, where planes were taking off one after another, streaking silver against a blue sky finally free of storm clouds. "Maybe rest isn't what I was made for," he said. "Maybe I was made to keep the air honest." As the afternoon light poured into the office, the phone rang. It was a reporter requesting an exclusive interview. Dana reached to answer, but Elijah stopped her gently. "Not today," he said. "Let the story breathe without me." He stood at the window for a long moment, hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon. The sky was endless, no longer a battlefield, but a reflection of what truth could become when someone refused to look away. He thought of his father, his mother, Clara, Margaret, Dana, all the people who had carried parts of this truth with him. And then, in the stillness of that moment, he whispered to the glass, "We fly cleaner now." Winter came quietly to Seattle, the kind that wrapped the skyline in mist and made even the brightest lights seem thoughtful. 3 months had passed since the Carter Commission was announced, and Elijah Carter had spent nearly every waking hour building what others said could never exist, a framework of ethics strong enough to outlast him. The conference room on the top floor of North Star headquarters was filled with officials, lawyers, and representatives from other airlines. The air buzzed with polite tension, the kind that comes when people are forced to admire the man who proved them wrong. Elijah sat at the head of the table, not as a conqueror, but as a craftsman shaping something fragile and necessary. Dana Wells, now promoted to Chief Compliance Officer, stood beside him, outlining the new initiative, a global transparency network linking airline maintenance, passenger rights, and safety logs into a single public database. No more hidden records, no more quiet cover-ups. One executive shifted uneasily. Mr. Carter, you're talking about publishing internal data to the public. That's unprecedented. Elijah folded his hands. So was grounding every plane in America. Yet we're still here. The room went silent. The man lowered his gaze. Dana continued with measured confidence. We call it the Clear Sky Protocol. It launches next month. Every participating airline will be accountable in real time. After the meeting, when the others had left, Dana turned to Elijah. You know half those people are terrified of you. He smiled slightly. Then maybe fear is finally serving something useful. She shook her head, smiling back. You've changed. You know, you used to speak like a quiet storm. Now you're thunder that waits its turn. He looked at her, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. And you've become the lightning that keeps me honest. That night, Elijah walked alone through the hangar where the first Clear Sky servers were being installed. The machines hummed with life, lines of data streaming across their monitors, every flight log, every inspection note, every system check. He placed his hand on the metal casing and whispered, "Let truth outlive me." The next day, a headline broke the calm. Alan Brooks released, on bail claims retaliation, by Carter. The news spread fast. Within hours, social media ignited with speculation. Some pundits accused Elijah of using government power for personal vengeance. Others defended him, calling Brooks's claims desperate noise. Dana entered his office, her phone glowing with updates. They're trying to pull you back into the mud, she said. Brooks is demanding a public debate. He's booked on a major talk show tonight. Elijah looked up slowly. Then I'll be there? Her eyes widened. You sure he'll twist every word? He's not after truth. He's after blood. He took a breath. Sometimes people have to see what lies look like next to calm. That evening, the studio lights were harsh, the air cold with anticipation. Alan Brooks sat across from Elijah, his smile thin and practiced. Cameras blinked red. The host introduced them with the excitement of a prize fight. Tonight, she said, we have two men at the heart of aviation's biggest scandal, one who built it and one who grounded it. Alan spoke first, his voice slick with charm. Elijah Carter's actions destroyed livelihoods. Thousands of employees lost paychecks because he wanted to play hero. He didn't save aviation, he crippled it. The host turned to Elijah. Mr. Carter, your response. Elijah's tone was steady, almost gentle. What I did was stop a system from pretending it was safe. I didn't ground an airline. I grounded arrogance. Alan laughed bitterly. You talk about arrogance while you sit there draped in moral superiority. You used one incident of so-called discrimination as a ladder to power. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. The only ladder I ever climbed was built by those who came before me, people who had to prove their worth twice to be seen once. The studio fell silent. Alan leaned forward. You humiliated me. Elijah tilted his head slightly. You humiliated yourself when you made cruelty look like procedure. The host tried to cut in, but the audience was already reacting, whispers, gasps, applause. Alan's expression faltered. For the first time, his mask cracked. Elijah continued, Quieter now. You see, Mr. Brooks, the difference between us is simple. You built your success on silence. I built mine on listening. And when the silent finally spoke, you called it mutiny. When the show ended, the network phones crashed under the volume of calls. By morning, the internet had declared the exchange historic. Analysts replayed it frame by frame, calling it the night decency spoke. Back in Seattle, Elijah sat alone in his office, the glow of the city beyond the window. Dana entered quietly, holding 2 cups of tea, as she always did. "You know," she said, "I think you finally buried him without ever raising your voice." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "No one buries lies. They bury themselves." She looked at him carefully. "And you? What do you bury?" He turned toward the glass, watching the faint reflection of his face. "Doubt. Every day." For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Comfortable. Real. Then Dana said softly, "The Carter Commission is expanding. They want to include international partners. Europe's calling." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll listen, not lecture. Change doesn't belong to one country." As winter deepened, the reforms spread. Airlines began signing the Clear Sky agreements, one after another. FAA reports praised the transparency model. Accidents dropped. Customer trust soared. What began as a scandal had evolved into a global shift, and Elijah became, reluctantly, its quiet architect. Yet not everything healed at once. Late one night, he received a letter unsigned, written in clean, slanted handwriting. "You may have changed the rules, but some wounds don't show on paper. Some of us will never forget the years we flew afraid." He read it 3 times. It didn't anger him. It humbled him. He placed it in a drawer beside his father's old wrench, the one he'd carried since his 20s. The weight of both items reminded him that progress was never tidy. A few days later, he visited a community center near the airport where laid-off North Star employees had been offered retraining. The room smelled of coffee and sawdust. Men and women in work uniforms sat around tables, taking notes, studying new skills. When they noticed him, whispers rippled through the room. He walked forward quietly. "I know what I cost you," he said, his voice low but clear. "And I know no apology fills a paycheck. But I didn't do this to punish anyone. I did it because someday your children deserve to fly on planes that never lie." One man stood tall, weathered, with grease-stained hands. "You made it hard for us, Mr. Carter," he said. "But maybe hard was what we needed." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "So did I." As he left the center, the air outside felt different, lighter, almost forgiving. The clouds were breaking, and faint sunlight spilled across the tarmac. He stopped for a moment, breathing it in. Dana was waiting by the car. "You look peaceful," she said. "Maybe peace isn't the absence of noise," he replied softly. "Maybe it's the sound of truth settling in." When he looked up, a plane was ascending steady, confident, unhurried. Its engines were quiet, but sure. For the first time, he didn't see it as machinery. He saw it as a promise. He whispered, "Fly honest," and as the aircraft disappeared into the brightening sky, Elijah Carter, the man once denied his seat, felt, at last, that he had earned one not in first class, but in history. By the time spring painted Seattle in pale gold, Elijah Carter had become a reluctant symbol of reform. Every headline, every talk show, every leadership summit wanted a piece of him, the man who grounded arrogance, the conscience of the skies, the quiet storm that saved aviation. The titles came endlessly, but none of them captured the truth he felt deep down. He hadn't saved anything. He had only stopped a lie before it became another tragedy. The Carter Commission had now expanded to 10 countries. Every week, Elijah found himself between flights and meetings, shaking hands with ministers, engineers, activists, and critics. But beneath the applause, there was a new kind of resistance forming, a silent network of executives and investors who saw transparency not as progress, but as a threat. They called themselves the Consortium, and they were powerful enough to undo everything he'd built if they ever worked in unison. One gray morning. Dana Wells entered his office holding an envelope marked confidential. "You're going to want to see this," she said, sliding it across his desk. Elijah unfolded the letter carefully. It was unsigned, printed on cream paper, brief but venomous. "Your reforms are bleeding this industry dry. You've mistaken chaos for courage. Step down before you bring down everyone else." He read it twice, then folded it again with quiet precision. "Cowards never sign their threats," he murmured. Dana crossed her arms. "This isn't just a letter. We've traced the postmark to a private law firm that handles some of the biggest airline conglomerates. They're meeting next week in Zurich. We think they're planning to form a counter-lobby." Elijah's gaze didn't flicker. "Then we'll meet them first." The following week, he flew to Zurich with Dana and Margaret Hayes. The Carter Commission had arranged a global aviation ethics summit there, but the real meeting, the one that mattered, was the one unannounced. In a private boardroom overlooking the frozen river, Elijah faced 6 of the most powerful figures in the industry. Gray suits, polished shoes, cold eyes. They controlled fleets, airports, and governments alike. One man leaned forward, his tone smooth but sharp. "Mr. Carter, your vision is noble, but you've created instability. Transparency slows profit. The world doesn't run on ethics. It runs on efficiency." Elijah's response was calm, but edged with steel. "Then maybe your definition of efficiency is what broke it in the first place." Another woman interjected, her accent clipped and British. "Your clear sky system makes companies vulnerable. Public confidence can't handle this level of exposure. One leak, one misstep, and entire economies tremble." Elijah met her gaze evenly. "Then fix your mistakes before they leak." The man at the head of the table, a tall, silver-haired executive named Charles DeWitt, spoke last. His voice was low, controlled. "We admire your conviction, Mr. Carter, but conviction doesn't pay bills. Step away now, and we'll protect what's left of your company. Continue this crusade, and you'll be isolated financially and politically." Elijah leaned forward, folding his hands. "Mr. DeWitt, let me tell you something my father taught me when I was 10 years old. He said, 'Son, if the only way to keep your job is to stay quiet about what's wrong, then the job's already gone. It just doesn't know it yet.'" Silence spread across the room. He continued, softer now, but every word deliberate. "I'm not here to protect companies. I'm here to protect people from what companies become when no one tells them the truth." DeWitt smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then may the truth keep you warm when the shareholders turn their backs." When the meeting ended, Dana exhaled deeply as they stepped into the crisp air outside. That sounded like a threat. Elijah nodded. It was, but threats are just promises, afraid to speak honestly. 2 weeks later, Northstar's stock plummeted 14% overnight. Anonymous reports accused the company of data manipulation, the very sin it had fought against. Financial news outlets ran wild. The Carter Commission's credibility was suddenly under fire. Margaret stormed into Elijah's office that morning, fury in her tone. "They planted this. I've seen the metadata. It's deliberate sabotage." Elijah listened, silent. Then he asked, "Can we trace it?" "Not yet," she said. "But we will." Dana slammed her phone on the desk. "The board's panicking. They want to suspend Clear Sky until an investigation is done." Elijah looked between them, his expression unreadable. "No, we don't pause truth because liars get loud. We investigate and we let the public see every step." Dana hesitated. "You'll be crucified." He met her eyes. "Then I'll burn bright enough to light what comes after." That afternoon, Elijah called a press conference. Reporters flooded the room, microphones flashing like lightning. Cameras rolled as he stepped up to the podium, his calm presence filling the silence. "There's been an attempt," he began, "to discredit the very system built to keep you safe. False data, forged logs, and coordinated lies. I want you to hear this from me. North Star has nothing to hide. Starting today, every internal audit, every security trace, every line of code from Clear Sky will be made public." The crowd erupted in questions, but he raised a hand gently. "Transparency doesn't fear the dark," he said. "It simply turns on the light faster." The clip spread worldwide. Within hours, tech analysts verified the Clear Sky systems had indeed been hacked. Public sympathy swung back toward Elijah. But the war wasn't over. That night, sitting in his dimly lit office, Elijah watched rain streak the windows. He was tired, more tired than he'd ever admitted. Dana entered quietly, placing a folder on his desk. "Forbes just called," she said. "They want to name you Leader of the Year." He looked up, weary amusement in his eyes. "For what? Surviving honesty." She smiled sadly. "For changing how people think leadership should look." He didn't respond. His gaze drifted to the skyline, its reflection shimmering in the glass. "You know what scares me, Dana? What that someday someone will use my name to justify the very corruption I tried to stop." She stepped closer. "Then keep reminding them who you are." He turned toward her, voice softer now. "Who I am is just a man who once got told he didn't belong in first class." Maybe that was the best lesson of all. In the weeks that followed, the investigation confirmed everything Margaret suspected. The data breach had been orchestrated by the consortium. Executives resigned, governments intervened, and for the first time, the entire industry began to fracture toward reform rather than resistance. But Elijah didn't celebrate. Instead, he visited the hangar at night, as he always did when the noise grew too heavy. Luis Ortega was there, working late. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Boss Luis asked, wiping grease from his hands. Elijah smiled faintly. "Sleep feels like a privilege I haven't earned yet." Luis laughed. "You've earned more than anyone I know. My son's training to be a pilot now. He said he wants to fly for a company that tells the truth. Guess that's your fault." Elijah's chest tightened with quiet pride. Then maybe all this noise was worth it. They stood together in silence for a while, watching a test plane idle on the runway. The hum of its engine was steady, reassuring. Luis spoke again. "You ever think about quitting? Just walking away?" Elijah shook his head. "Every day. And then I remember the sky doesn't need another pilot. It needs a witness." When he walked out into the cool night air, the city glowed beneath him, and for a fleeting moment, he felt peace. Not victory, just peace. The kind that comes when you realize the fight was never about winning. It was about staying human in a world that forgets how. He whispered into the wind. The truth can take the turbulence. And somewhere high above, a plane cut through the clouds steady, unafraid, and free. A year had passed since the day Elijah Carter grounded every plane in the nation. Time, in its quiet persistence, had transformed that act of defiance into legend. Universities taught it as a case study in ethical leadership. Journalists still debated whether he had been brave or reckless. But inside Elijah's modest office overlooking the Seattle skyline, none of that mattered anymore. He wasn't chasing history. He was trying to make sure the sky stayed clean. North Star had stabilized under the Clear Sky Protocol. Incidents had dropped to their lowest levels in decades. Public confidence soared. The Carter Commission, once doubted, now had representatives in 22 countries. Airlines that had once mocked him now sought his approval before launching reforms. For the first time, it felt like justice had roots, not headlines. Still, Elijah felt the fatigue of a man who had carried too much truth for too long. He had seen every form of resistance, every disguise of greed pretending to be progress. Late one evening, he stood by the window, tea cooling in his hand, watching aircrafts trace bright lines across the dusk. Dana Wells entered quietly, holding a small stack of letters. "From passengers," she said softly. "We get new ones every week." He smiled faintly. Still. She nodded. This one stood out. She handed him an envelope postmarked from Detroit. Inside, a handwritten note. "My husband died in a crash 20 years ago. Back then, no one cared why. They just moved on. When you grounded those planes, I cried for the first time in years, not because of what was lost, but because someone finally cared enough to stop pretending." Elijah set the letter down, his throat tightening. "Sometimes," he murmured, "the past doesn't vanish. It just waits to be acknowledged." Dana watched him carefully. "You've done that for a lot of people. Elijah, maybe it's time to do it for yourself." He didn't answer. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Not violent, just a reminder that storms always return. The next morning, Margaret Hayes arrived unannounced. "We've got a problem," she said, setting her tablet on the desk. "One of the airlines under the Commission Celestaire falsified engine data. Again, they tried to bury it under the transparency logs." Elijah frowned. "After everything? After all the protocols?" "Yes," Margaret said grimly. "They learned how to cheat the system that was supposed to stop cheating." Dana swore under her breath. "It never ends." Elijah's face was calm, but something inside him shifted a familiar ache between disappointment and resolve. "Then we start over," he said quietly. "Not from scratch, from truth." Margaret looked at him. "The board wants to keep this quiet. They're worried exposure will damage global trust again." He turned sharply. "Trust doesn't break when we reveal the truth. It breaks when we hide it." Later that day, he called an emergency meeting with Celestaire executives. The boardroom was filled with faces that wore guilt like cologne, heavy, perfumed, and unconvincing. Elijah sat at the head of the table, eyes steady, voice low. "You had every tool to prevent this," he said. "You had the technology, the oversight, the transparency, and you still chose the shortcut." One of the executives shifted uneasily. "We were under pressure to meet schedules. The data delay would have cost us millions." Elijah leaned forward. "And what would a crash cost? Or a single life silence?" He continued, softer but cutting. "You think reform is a finish line. It isn't. It's a treadmill you stop running. You fall." When the meeting ended, he walked alone across the tarmac outside. Planes gleamed under the rain-soaked sky, engines whispering like confessions. He thought of his father again, of the way the man used to wipe his hands clean on a rag and say, "Machines don't lie, son. People do." That evening, Elijah held another press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped to the podium, calm but visibly weary. "We've discovered another breach," he announced. "It proves that integrity isn't a one-time act. It's a discipline, and discipline takes practice." He paused, scanning the sea of faces before him. "Some of you call me idealistic. Maybe I am. But I'd rather lose faith in systems than lose faith in people. Because people can still change." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was quiet, sincere, the kind that feels like understanding. Afterward, Elijah returned to his apartment. He poured himself a glass of water. sat at the small table by the window, and let the city sounds fill the silence. Cars humming, distant laughter, the rhythm of life moving forward. Dana called a few minutes later. "You look tired up there," she said softly. "I am," he admitted. "But it's the good kind. The kind that comes when the work's still unfinished. You know," she said gently, "some people think you've changed the world." Elijah smiled faintly. "No. I just asked it to look at itself." There was a pause on the line before Dana spoke again. "You ever think about what's next?" He looked out at the horizon, where the last traces of sunset were fading. "Maybe," he said, "it's time to let others lead. The air's clearer now. Maybe that's enough." The next day, Elijah made an unannounced visit to North Star's training center. Inside, young pilots studied flight simulations, their faces lit by the glow of digital skies. He watched quietly from the back, listening to an instructor explain how clear sky protocols had changed their responsibilities. One trainee raised his hand. "Sir, is it true that Mr. Carter used to be a pilot?" The instructor smiled. "Not quite, but he taught us all how to fly differently." Elijah chuckled quietly to himself. As he turned to leave, the trainee caught sight of him and froze. The others followed his gaze, realizing who stood in the doorway. The room fell silent. Elijah nodded politely. "Don't look at me," he said with a gentle grin. "Look at the horizon. That's who you're racing." When he stepped outside, the sky was unusually clear, one of those rare Seattle days where the air felt wide enough to breathe. Margaret was waiting by the car, holding a file. "The Celeste Air case is wrapped up. The CEO resigned this morning. The commission is safe." He nodded. "Good. Now we make it better." "Do you ever stop?" she asked, half amused. Elijah's smile was tired but peaceful. "You don't stop when you're flying. You just level out." That night, he walked along the waterfront where the lights of departing planes shimmered across the bay. A small crowd had gathered near the pier, watching the sky. A little boy pointed upward and shouted, "That's North Star. My mom works there." Elijah smiled, his chest tightening with quiet joy. He sat on a bench, pulled a notepad from his pocket, and began to write not a speech, not a statement, but something more personal, a letter to himself. "There will always be storms," he wrote. "But remember this, the sky never holds a grudge. It clears, again and again, no matter how dark it gets. So must we." He signed it simply, E.C. Hours later, when the city lights dimmed and only the faint hum of night remained, Elijah stood once more at his window. From somewhere deep within the clouds, a plane ascended steady, golden, free. He whispered, almost to himself. We kept it honest, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to rest. The next morning, Dana arrived early. His office was quiet, sunlight spilling across the desk. The letter sat beside his cold cup of tea, folded neatly. She read it once, smiled through tears, and whispered, "You did it, Elijah." Outside, the skies were open, vast, and impossibly clear, as if the world itself remembered the man who taught it, that even after grounding, flight can still mean freedom. This story reminds us that real strength is not in revenge, but in restraint. Elijah Carter's journey shows that dignity does not need to shout. It stands its ground quietly until the world has no choice but to listen. For those of us who've lived long enough to see fairness tested and faith forgotten, his story rekindles something simple yet profound. Decency still matters. When injustice comes, it tempts us to fight anger with anger. But Elijah teaches that lasting change begins when we use wisdom instead of wrath. His decision to confront cruelty with integrity didn't just fix an airline. It challenged an entire culture. In every life, there are moments when we must decide whether to mirror the world's cruelty or rise above it. So perhaps the lesson is, this: never confuse silence with weakness, or kindness with surrender. True justice grows slowly like dawn after a long night, but it always arrives for those who refuse to stop believing in it. Thank you for watching and sharing this powerful story with us. If Elijah Carter's journey moved you, let it remind us all that change begins with one brave choice. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about courage, compassion, and justice. Your support helps us keep these voices alive. See you in the next story.